World leaders got together virtually this week for a bit of an impromptu climate summit called by President Joe Biden before the big climate conference in Glasgow later in the year. Today on the Debunking Economics podcast, we're going to look at climate change, but in particular the approach that's advocated by Bill Gates, which is all about the green premium. To go green costs more. If we can change that so that it doesn't cost any more, then the carbon-free choice will be the way to go every time. Is it that simple? We'll explore that idea today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Well, there's a certain irony to the podcast this week as we talk about the environment, and we're talking to Steve Keen, who's sitting there with the air conditioning blasting out on a hot day in Thailand. Look, Steve, I've been watching a TED talk with Bill Gates talking about the need to remove the green premium, which he's saying is the difference in cost between a product that involves emitting carbon and an alternative product that doesn't. So zero emissions do not cost more than carbon emitting products is the aim. But is that a bit of a pipe dream? I mean, it would be beautiful if we could get there, wouldn't it? If we could say, well, okay, buy this product because it's the same as that product, but it hasn't harmed the environment in any way, and it doesn't cost any more. He says, we need zero carbon waste to generate electricity, to grow food, make things that we move around, and also help keep us warm or cool. Like if you had zero emitting air conditioning, for example, what a beautiful place the world would be.
Well, actually, there's one way in which I think global warming is doing us a favour, and that is that it's an obvious, relatively simple mechanism compared to destroying the web of life on the planet. And if we find ourselves jeopardising ourselves just by that, we might think more about the web of life before we destroy that completely as well. But to me, one of the dangers of this is seeing it all through the guise of trying to get the prices right. And this is the usual story of economics in general, that it thinks everything can be solved by getting the prices right, which effectively implies that the ecology is a wholly owned subsidiary of the economy. And the reality is precisely the opposite. The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the ecology, and we're destroying it from the inside out. We're the alien inside the body in that case. And I'm never particularly enthusiastic about a mechanism that just tries to change relative prices as if that's going to solve the whole problem.
Well, actually, it could mean our consumption goes up, couldn't it? Which is a different issue. Because he gives the example of air fuel and the green premium. He says the average retail price for a gallon of jet fuel in the United States over the past few years has been around $2.22, while advanced biofuels for jets cost around $5.35 per gallon. So the green premium is the difference between the two, which is $3.
Not that I'd call biofuels green, by the way, but anyway.
Well, okay, yeah. Well, hydrogen maybe was we can talk about that in a second. But anyway, let's follow his logic. So he says the green premium is the difference between the two, which is $3.13, or an increase of 140%. Since airlines would not be willing to pay more than twice as much to fuel their planes, and many customers would balk at resulting increase in airfares, the green premium on biofuels suggests that we need to find other ways to either make them cheaper or make jet fuel more expensive, or a combination of the two. Well, duh. But if you were to achieve that and get it so that biofuels or whatever is the way forward that's not going to harm the planet, we would, and it was the same price, then we would carry on flying as much as we are now, possibly even more.
And that's the problem. I think this is where can we continue on the same growth trajectory we've been on. Just having that growth involving less carbon. And that would be possible if carbon was the only thing we were dumping into the environment and the only load we were putting on the planet. But it's just the most obvious load. And if we then think, well, here's a way we can actually manage to either reduce the carbon load or to spread the cost of it to discourage more carbon over time, it might not be carbon that kills us. It might be simply that destruction of the overall web of life, which we're doing quite possibly at the level of destroying phytoplankton. We could be taking that down, and that's what brings down the fish populations, and that brings down the human populations. At some point, carbon could be a sideshow, a very important one.
Yeah,
but a sideshow.
But if we are saying, well, okay, we're going to do less of travel or we're going to consume less, then that becomes, ironically, I guess it means there's less incentive actually to try and find alternatives to what we're doing. So if we say we're going to travel less, then that's going to be less of a problem. So then perhaps we need to invest less in trying to find a green alternative. We'll just fly less. We'll still fly heavily polluting planes. We won't ship as many goods around the world. So we're happy to have heavily polluting container vessels, because there's going to be fewer of them. Whereas if we say, well, okay, we're going to maintain our levels at the current levels, then there becomes an incentive, doesn't there? So then we can say, well, okay, if we're going to fly as much, it may be a bad thing. I'm just looking at both sides of this argument. If we're going to fly as much, then maybe we say, oh, let's look at hydrogen powered jets, for example. Let's invest a lot of money into that. Let's look at ways that we can ship goods around the world with hydrogen powered container vessels, whatever the most efficient way. If we're going to do less of it, then the incentive to invest, to try and find alternatives, diminishes a bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a lot of this stuff is sort of taking a micro approach to a macro problem. Let's use the price system to get costs up, so people will therefore do it less through their consumption motivations and the price mechanism. But a large part of what we're talking about is a simple macro issue. We are producing far more carbon than we should. If we want to have a stable climate on the planet. So we're already, there's actually a website that I located when I was writing the current book, the New Economics Manifesto, and I found a website that collates data from a huge number of studies of temperature around the world and lets you put in comparative dates to work out just how much hotter are we now than we were X years ago. And when I did it for the period 1900 to 1920, which is pretty much as far back as the data goes, and looked at annual anomalies, we were already at 1.3 degrees above the level of temperature that applied from 1900 to 1920. So that is a macro issue that's telling us we've consumed far too much carbon, we've dumped it into the atmosphere and drastically increased the temperature of the planet. We have to take a macro approach and work back from that. And I think ultimately that's where we find ourselves heading to. But doing it through the price mechanism won't cut it.
But isn't his approach through the price mechanism, isn't it a macro approach? Because he seems to be saying, well, if we get this green premium down to zero, and he's saying it's not much, by the way. He reckons it's $18 a month for the average household, which isn't a great deal to pay. That's how much the difference is between you paying for something which is creating carbon versus something that's not. If we got carbon emissions down to zero, no matter how much we flew or how far we took goods around the world, then taking your point that there are other repercussions on the planet, not just from carbon emissions, but just our level of consumption. But if we, there's lots of untapped energy, obviously coming from the sun. If we could tap all that and without any extra cost, then the price mechanism works, doesn't it? That becomes his approach is all about saying, well, let's get it down to zero, so that there's zero carbon emissions.
Yeah,
everything looks sweet.
No, it's about getting the price right so that the quantity drops out from the marketplace.
But that's not what he's saying. He's saying let's get the price down, not to reduce the quantity. He's saying that the quantity stays the same. He's saying let's just get the price down through investment in alternative technologies.
So that those alternative technologies replace the carbon-based ones.
Yeah. That's what when he talks about the green premium, he says, yeah, it's the cost of how much more it costs to do something that doesn't emit carbon, and we've got to get that down to zero. That's got to be the focus.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's not a mechanism I'm going to argue against, but I don't think it's the entire. There's no single solution to any of these issues. So yes, it would help if it didn't cost you more money to use a non-carbon based form of energy than a carbon-based system. And that would therefore mean it's a sort of why not decision to go across to carbon-free as based on carbon. But if we still have the same growth trends, then even though we're not pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we're still increasing the load we put on the biosphere.
And on that point, you might think, well, there we are. That's reached a conclusion that there's more than just Bill Gates' approach to all of this, but there's also more to this podcast as well. And if you want to hear it in full, the full half an hour, then subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. Become a supporter there, and you can listen to this full version of this podcast and 250 or more other podcasts that we've done over the years as well. That's it for this week. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. Back again for another one next week. Thanks for listening.